Joining me now is Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow Gordon Chang. Gordon, good to see you. And you're raising China in a new op-ed. You say China is the biggest winner of the Trump-Putin summit. Why is that?
Well, China does not want to see the war in Ukraine end. And we know this because of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's conversation with Kaja Kallas of July 2nd. She is the EU foreign policy chief. And Wang Yi said that China does not want Russia to lose because if it does, then the United States will focus on China and East Asia. Well, if the war ends, however it ends, the U.S. similarly will be able to focus on China in Asia. So I think China is feeding this conflict by support for Russia, all in support, including troops in Ukraine, and it wants to make sure that the U.S. is kept off focus.
Yeah. So what can the U.S. do at this point to convince China that it is not in its best interest, if it wants to be a good actor on the world stage, it is not in its best interest to support Russia's war?
Unfortunately, I don't think we can appeal to Beijing's better interests. Beijing believes and defines its interests in a way which is very different than we think that the way it should. The only way that we get China to move in a better direction is to impose severe costs on China. And so far, the Trump administration has been unwilling to do that. On August 6th, they imposed an additional 25% tariff on India for buying Russian oil. But China buys more Russian oil than India does, and we have not imposed those tariffs on China. China looks at that and says that the United States is weak. Now, I don't agree with that, and I'm sure President Trump doesn't, but that's the way the Chinese see it. And that's important because that motivates them. And that encourages them to be even more aggressive with regard to Ukraine, trade, and everything else for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's so difficult to try to understand where a trade deal is going. I mean, President Trump has been very careful here. He shows what is possible in terms of his positioning on China, but then sometimes he backs off because he doesn't want a full-out World War III with China, because he knows we're so reliant on the Chinese supply chains. And in the meantime, he's trying to strengthen America to get the supply chains here. But, so far, we don't have the specifics on how the trade deal changes with China. We're still in that temporary mode. We are, by the way, waiting on details between the EU and the U.S. on the final details of the trade deal there. But let me get your take on these final arguments now underway in Hong Kong. This is for the trial of the pro-democracy media mogul Jimmy Lai. Of course, we've been among the few really covering this, and we keep a focus on it because it represents all that China has done to squash free speech. A lawyer representing Jimmy Lai said this: "It's not wrong to support freedom of expression. It's not wrong to support human rights. It's not wrong to try to persuade the government to change its policy, nor is it not wrong to love a particular administration or even a country, because you can't force someone to think in one way or another." Jimmy Lai faces life in prison if convicted under a national security law imposed by Beijing after anti-government protests happened in 2019. Jimmy's son and Free Jimmy Lai campaign leader, Sebastian Lai, was with me just last week. He told me there's no chance his father is going to get a free and fair trial this week. Watch.
He's not going to get a fair trial. There's no chance of a fair trial. I think anybody seeing the length of this trial, the conditions of this trial, knows that it's completely politically motivated. My father is in jail in Hong Kong for essentially courage, because he decided to stand up for freedom and democracy and stay and defend his journalists. So, there's so much at stake in this trial. All the freedoms of Hong Kong are being put on trial, and there's just no chance that he's going to get anything close to a fair trial.
Gordon, what's your reaction?
Sebastian Lai is right. This trial shows the evil nature of the Chinese regime. And by the way, the people in Taiwan must be looking at this because they see the way China has treated Hong Kong, and that's the way that China would treat Taiwan or any other country. This is a real important issue. We've seen the inhumane treatment of Jimmy Lai in prison. We have seen the intransigence of both Beijing and Hong Kong. Now, I'm sure that Beijing does not want to see Jimmy Lai die in trial, in custody, because if that were to occur, he'd become even more of a martyr, even more of a symbol than he already is. But unfortunately, you have the Hong Kong government. This whole trial feeds into their national security narrative, the one of John Lee, the chief executive of Hong Kong. And so there is going to be a very difficult time for Jimmy to try to get him free. And President Trump deserves all the credit for actually talking about Jimmy Lai's predicament in custody.
Yeah, he has been so smart on the China relationship. But Gordon, I mean, what do you make of this headline that I just read a moment ago, that Russia has launched a massive aerial attack on Ukraine, including 574 drones and 40 missiles this morning? We're confirming details of this, but how is this acceptable? After President Trump went all the way to Alaska to meet with Putin, the Europeans went all the way to the White House to talk about this, and now we're back at it. Russia is back at it on Ukraine, and China is back at it supporting. I mean, what can be done?
Well, what can be done is that we cut off all the flow of money to Russia.
Right.
No oil sales, no sales of anything else, because if there's no money, there's no war. And this war stops really quickly if we are able to not only increase our sanctions, but enforce them, because we have not been enforcing sanctions to the extent that we should. So really, this is an issue. Putin is not going to change. This is Putin's operation. He's, he's the war criminal of the 21st century. And so we've got to realize we can't entice him into good behavior. Unfortunately, we've just got to defeat him. I know that's politically unpopular, but the problem is if we don't defeat him, if we leave him in possession of Ukrainian territory, we open the door to war in East Asia, because China then think it can grab territory from neighbors and keep it. So there's a lot on stake here. It's not just Ukraine. This is the future of Asia.
All right. We will be watching all of that. Gordon, great to get your take as always. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Maria.
Gordon Chang. We'll be right back. Stay with us.